All right, this should be the third and final part of the Brady Bunch Disclosure Edition. And I will once again, if you want to communicate, usually Twitter is best, and my blog is there, which the transcript of this will be on my blog. And my PayPal, if you so desire, and Patreon, very simple. And last but not least, Vimeo. And we'll get back to where we left off. So, we left off, Lou had just finished talking about how, yeah, this field is a mess. And Ralph Blumenthal jumped in and said, and this is new, this is where we left off. He goes, I got to say, one of the fascinating things about this is, and John Mack wrestled with this, as Danny knows, some people have had these insights or contacts like you, Marshall, and others have not, like John Mack and me. And the people who have not had these contacts find them very difficult to believe, and the people who have had them find them impossible to disbelieve. So the question is, and this is something that might be amenable to scientific investigation, what marks the difference between the different people? Why do some people have this ability or have these experiences and other people do not? And what strikes me as something that is worthy of scientific investigation, because in the end, the only way we're ever going to we're ever going to get these stories into the paper or this phenomenon examined is by some means of authentication. Either it's the government saying something, so we're more inclined to believe it, or it's Lou putting his name on something that gets it into the New York Times. But just an anecdotal account, with all due respect, Marshall, is not going to get it into the New York Times because no one knows what to make of it. And Danny jumps in and says, let's go to Adam. You were right, Ralph, in referring this to Adam. Adam, what's your sense about this? And can you share? Surprisingly enough, a lot of people are not aware of the remote viewing stuff that was done by the Stanford Research Institute and Hal Puthoff and the Office of Naval Intelligence in the military. I may totally be off on this, and this is me speaking, but I've never heard the Office of Naval Intelligence be connected to the remote viewing program, and I may just not know that, but I think Danny may be mistaking their connection to the UAP task force and, blending it in with the remote viewing. Not 100% sure, but I've never heard it come up. So Danny asks Adam, just share a little bit about what you know about remote viewing and your view of the credibility of that and how it relates to, if at all, to the kind of research you were doing there at Princeton. And Adam says, and Adam talks very carefully. He's like Dean Radin. Adam says, there's the question of the authenticity of the piece of the psi research, which is pretty well documented, as I discussed. There's also the question of, is there something unique about individuals who have these capacities that might open a door for more empirical evidence for these things? And there is some. One of the things that the Pear Lab and psi research in general, however, have discovered is that while there are some superstars, and by the way, the superstars are Joe McMonagle, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Hella Hamid, and that one intuitive, the medical intuitive, who was in my Kit Green transcript. And Kit Green also names Uri Geller, and people may say, oh, Uri Geller is a fraud, but Kit Green has been doing this for a long time. So when he says Uri Geller is one of the people that is accurate most of the time when it comes to data that you can check up on, you can verify, like medical data, I listen to Kit Green. He goes, Adam says, while there are some people who are superstars, everybody seems to have these abilities. It seems to be more related to the nature of consciousness itself than the skills with which an individual wields it. Now, there are superstars. There's some evidence that people who have high levels of gamma brain functioning in the brain, that creates coherence in the brain, and in these moments are more given to, let's call it, weird abilities. So people who have high gamma brain functioning are more likely to have these weird abilities. But then he says, the problem is, though, because there are people who are schizophrenic who also have high levels of gamma, so maybe that's not really a good example. He says they did a study at Pear, and here's the study. I'm just going to tell you how I know the study because I read his explanation. You get a room and 4 corners, and you put a plant that needs light, like all plants, and you put it in one of the corners, and you have a growing bulb at the top of the room, and it goes in one of 4 directions, the 4 corners, and you use a random number generator that spits out 1, 2, 3, or 4, and 1 is one corner, 2 is the other corner, 3 is the other corner, and 4 is the other corner. One of those corners is the plant. So randomly, you would expect the random number generator to point in each corner of the room, 4 corners, 25% of the time. But what they find is it's shining in the corner where the plant is more than 25%. So this was not a peer-reviewed study. It was published as a technical report. It has not been replicated, but it's really interesting if that's what's going on, because as Adam says, he says, I think it's important because it tells us that this is what consciousness does. Basically the plant is willing the random number generator to shine the light on the plant more often than it does in the other 3 corners. But then Adam says, he says consciousness itself bends the fabric of space-time in the direction of what supports it, in the direction of its growth and its evolution. But then he says maybe it's an experimenter effect. You can get into this whole other side of things, of course. An experimenter effect, somehow maybe the consciousness of the experimenters is having an effect, and it's not the plant that's doing it. Either way, that would be impressive. So he goes, it's just something to keep in mind. This is just sort of what consciousness does. Now, is that going to get it into the New York Times? Probably not. And Ralph says, well, that might get into Science Times, by the way. That's an interesting experiment. And Adam says, yeah, that's an interesting one. Last thing on this, and I'll say that let's just separate the woo, right? But yeah, a lot of people have a problem with the word woo. Meanwhile, Adam lives in the world of woo, and he knows, he knows that's how some people think of it, especially mainstream scientists. He goes, so let's separate the woo, separate the Adam world, the weird psychic research stuff. There's plenty of mainstream work on the question of consciousness right now that's kind of pointing in the direction that we're talking about. There's a mini revolution taking place in the philosophy classrooms at universities surrounding philosophy of mind, and that is this question that if consciousness is an illusion, meaning if it's an epiphenomena produced by the brain, the question becomes an illusion to whom, right? I mean, you have to have consciousness to experience anything, including illusions. So it's very difficult to get behind consciousness. And from that simple philosophical argument that is pretty robust, it tells us that there might be something more, which is consciousness, deeper than all of the physical investigations that we make about the material world. And second is happening in neuroscience. So we thought for the last 30 years that neuroimaging improves as neuroimaging improves, and we get finer and finer images of the brain, better technology, then we're going to find out the place where consciousness comes from, right? Well, as neural imaging and fMRI and all these really wonderful technologies have developed, really good science behind it, we're no closer to finding where consciousness is in the brain. We're further away, in fact, than we ever thought. And in fact, it brings up an even deeper point, which is, why is it that subjectivity should be attendant to brain functioning at all? The brain is just 4 pounds of cells and water. Why do you have to have something happening inside of that with the appreciation of music and the experience of color and love and resonance and the whole panoply of subjective phenomena? Couldn't you just have cells firing back and forth without the need for any of that? It seems like very inefficient for nature to create, and yet we have it. So these are mainstream issues with which we're grappling along the lines of consciousness, pointing to something that consciousness, and then Ralph jumps in and says, in other words, Adam, it'd be a difference between AI, artificial intelligence. Let me start that again. He goes, in other words, and this is Blumenthal, in other words, Adam, it'd be a difference between an AI brain and a human brain, right? And Adam jumps right in. He says, no. In fact, I think that we're going to be dealing with these very questions when we actually get serious about AI. And we stop just using the term as a way to get venture capital funding. But if we are to progress down this road of the question of what is consciousness and how we can create it, and we're going to have to look at the fundamental nature of consciousness and probably also the psi research as well. And it's going to be a lot more difficult than having a really advanced computer with special machine learning software. So Danny jumps back in. Danny says, so the point is that, a lot of people don't know this, but I was actually shown copies of ostensibly classified information about the studies that were being done with remote viewing at the Stanford Research Institute with Pat Price. As it turns out, Ingo Swann, who was one of the major adepts that was working with them there, and by the way, Ingo Swann was an amazing New York-based natural psychic, and he was there in the very beginning with Hal Puthoff. Ingo was one of the... he wasn't a volunteer. He got paid. He did experiments with Hal, and that's how they came up with the remote viewing protocol with Russell Targ and some other folks. But Danny says that Ingo Swann was also a high-level clear in the Church of Scientology. That is not true. That was Pat Price. And he says, Ingo was providing deep inside classified documentation to the Church of Scientology. That was not Ingo. That was Pat Price. Richard Dolan jumps in and says, I think that was Pat Price. And Sheehan was like, nope, it was Ingo Swann. But it was Pat Price. And Danny says he saw the documents about this, and the capabilities that Pat Price displayed are something that almost no one could conceive of. His capabilities of learning how to do this and then being able to do this. He could, and I'm gonna explain in my own words, because basically what was amazing about Pat Price, his accuracy and details, but one of the things he was able to do is actually read, if there was a document in the area where he was remote viewing, he could read the title of the document. And that is something, I don't know anybody else that can do that. If there are people, I have not heard of it. And that's important because one of the targets early on, they were giving, Kit Green got a target for them to work, and some guy gave him Kit Green the target. Kit Green did not know what the target was. It turned out it was a cabin, really boring target. But Ingo Swann and Pat Price started describing like this facility behind razor wire fences, and it was a very secure, secret facility. And Pat Price, quote unquote, entered psychically into this one building, and he began to read the names on these folders, and it turned out the names were the names of secret special access programs. Allegedly, that's what Pat Price was doing. He was reading the names of special access programs, which would be, if that's true, what an amazing thing, and what an amazing, horrible thing for a government if you have a special access program and you have a code word. Meanwhile, here's this guy who can read it using his psychic abilities. So that caused a lot of problems, and Lou jumped in and he said, Pat Price got in trouble for that, Danny. You know that? And Dolan's like, that's right, that's right. And Danny's like, yeah, I know. And basically, they investigated. They tried to figure out, how are you guys finding out information about special access program code words? And there was an investigation, but it was, nobody had leaked classified information. It was supposedly it was Pat Price coming up with that information using his abilities, his sixth sense. So then Danny jumps in and he says, I'm talking about capacities of our human species to be able to do these kinds of things. And this was Danny. Danny was talking before, so he didn't just jump in. Sorry about that. He goes, I'm talking about the capacities of our human species to be able to do these kinds of things, because what it is that Marshall is talking about here is met with the same kind of derision that the UFO phenomenon was met with 50 years ago. And so, if in fact it's true that certain human beings are capable of discerning accurate information, and the unique thing about remote viewing was that it was able to be confirmed. And basically, yeah, they were able to get feedback on that particular session. It was an NSA facility, and there are other targets you can get feedback on. Say, you do a remote viewing of a really famous place like the Eiffel Tower, and if they draw a large structure, thin structure, and sometimes they'll say Paris, you can get feedback. Targets like Marshall Summers is doing, right now we do not have feedback. We don't know if it's true what he says about who's visiting us and their intent. So Danny continues. He goes, yeah, they knew where the sites were. They knew what the data was. They were, they knew what was in the building that Pat Price was able to get into. And so what I'm saying is, if we as a human family are going to try to come to grips with this extraordinary phenomenon that's happening here, I think that we need to get access, and he's talking about UFO phenomenon. I think we need to get access to all of the resources that we have, and that we cannot be confined by the limitations of what's getting ready to go into the New York Times, or what the Defense Department is willing to acknowledge. And yeah, I agree totally with Danny. You can't rely on that stuff. That would limit us too much. And Danny says, and now with Lue, now that you've come outside of that particular community that has all of those constraints, now we're able to assemble a team of people with the type of skills that we have here. And he's talking about the people on the panel, to try to figure out what the hell's going on. And then we get to Richard Dolan. And I will take a drink break. Richard Dolan pops in and says, so, fascinating conversation. I loved hearing Adam. I really enjoyed hearing Marshall as well. And Marshall, I just want you to know, for many years I have your first two books, and I stayed away from them. I shied away because I did not know how to make sense of the source of your information. It was that simple. But I decided that I really liked what you were saying, and I agreed with your basic message. I have a fundamental sympathy to that. And so I thought, I'm going to just look at your work on the basis of what you were saying. And on that basis, I think I really like what's in there. And I agree with Richard Dolan. It's different than most channel material. Marshall Summers' material seems different. Now, once I dig deeper, maybe I'll have a different opinion. But right now, I like it. And once again, whether or not it's accurate, I don't know. And then Dolan says, now, the other thing is, like Adam, I also studied remote viewing. I'm very engaged in that. And there is no question in my mind that there's a reality to that. So the problem that I've had is, as a historian, is it's similar to what Ralph has and what Lue has as well. Like, when you have to evaluate information, how do you decide what to include? And that's the problem. We don't all have to work at the same level of what constitutes valid evidence. And that's the beauty of it, because when we're dealing with this phenomenon, it's quite evident to all of us that we're dealing with something that is beyond our horizon to some extent. We have certain tremendous abilities of cognition and thinking things out, and we understand reality through space and through time, but there's this phenomenon that seems to go beyond what we're able to understand at times. And so we struggle with that. We may never get to the point where we truly understand this at the level we would want to. I think that's probably going to be the case. It doesn't mean we can't make progress, but it's difficult. And just real quick, I did study remote viewing back in '97, and then that was with Lynn Buchanan, one of the earlier members of the remote viewing program that was funded by the Army at that time. I also studied with Prudence Calabrese twice. I took her basic class, Lynn's basic class, and I was able to get information that, in my opinion, there was no other way I could have gotten it except through, some sort of sixth sense. I did not have any spectacular sessions. But Lynn was a great teacher, and I was able to pull up data that was just very unique that, people will say you were deluding yourself. You didn't get accurate information. I don't think so. I was pretty tough on myself. I mean, I was able to get some information that it just matched the target, so specific. And I didn't stay with it. I wish I would have stayed with it. But the one great thing about Lynn's class, which I don't think he teaches anymore, he's dealing with health issues, but you could take it as many times as you wanted. You pay for it, and the class was pricey. It was 3 days. It was $1,000, but you could take it for a lifetime. You can go back and take that class again as many times as you wanted to. I only took it once, and that was in San Francisco. But Richard goes on. He says, therefore, I think an important part of evidence, at least important to me, is context. When you have, like, I agree, anecdotal testimony, I cannot prove if a particular individual has seen either a UFO that they claim to have seen or gotten a message that they claim to have gotten. How could we possibly know that? But I do think that there's a level of proof that is rock solid that would even hold up in a court of science. Then there's a level of proof that's rock solid that would hold up in most courts of law. And then there's something that looks like it's probably true to a reasonable mind. And then Danny jumps in and says, yeah, that's the sheep example I was giving you earlier with Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Richard says, we have an intelligent person with a reasonable mind looking at the sum total of types of information that's coming to them, I think can also make a conclusion. In my view, that's also valid. So basically he's saying, you look at the information, use your judgment, you don't have the proof, but you can make a conclusion. Obviously it's not proof and it's your personal conclusion, but he says, in my view, that's also valid. And when I do my writing and my discussion of this, I will often go to that level. I think, Cheech and Chong, if it looks like it, tastes like it, smells like it, it's probably it. And I think it's often the same with a lot of other types of evidence and things that we encounter in our world. The easy thing to do with UFO evidence is to ignore it. That's what most people do. When you actually engage in it and you encounter it, you find, I can't prove that person, I can't prove that one, I can't prove that one, I can't prove that one, but they're all saying almost the exact same thing. So I'm going to work with that. And that's my attitude. And it doesn't mean that everything is a sure shot, but I think that's valid. And for that reason, I was very, very glad to hear Marshall and very glad to hear Adam talk about how this type of information can be valid. Doesn't prove Marshall's communication is valid, but it's not bad to have that type of, at least we can see that there's a possibility that these things can be real. I too have talked at length with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ about remote viewing. I know both of them quite well, and I knew Ingo, and I've met a lot of those other remote viewers. They're amazing people, and their stories are undeniable, it seems to me. So we have capabilities. We don't know how it works. We don't know the physics of remote viewing. We don't know the physics of telepathy. But that's the fault of our worldview and our science. It doesn't mean it isn't real. That's it. And then Mr. Blumenthal jumps in and says, my wife and I had dinner with Russell Targ a couple of years ago, and we were in his favorite restaurant, which has since closed down in Penn Station. And we're sitting across the table, and just on a whim, I said, Russell, remote viewing. Tell me what's in my wife's bag. And Ralph laughs, and he says, just like that, I put him on the spot. And Russell Targ drew on a napkin a shape of a flip-flop that was in her bag, and it freaked us both out. So I became a believer. And Richard says, it doesn't normally work like that, you realize, but actually there are people who can do that, and that's not the typical remote viewing, but there are people that are just naturals who can do just like that, They don't have to go through the remote viewing protocol. They just, on a whim, tell me what's in my bag. And there are people that would use extended remote viewing. That basically, there's no protocol. You would just lay down. You did not know the target beforehand. And you would get into that hypnagogic state of between sleep and being awake. And a perfect example of that is if you go online and type in Joe McMonagle Mars remote viewing. I believe he was at the Monroe Institute when he did that. Listen to him; you can tell he's right on that border of sleep, and that's how he did that session. A really cool session about, the supposed structures on Mars. So Danny, we get back to Danny. He says, "Let me try to draw this back to where we can, help to be practical." And he mentions how Mark Sims has access to a lot of money because he made a fortune, a significant amount of money in his earlier professional life. So they have access to that. They have access to other people who can provide resources. And then he's like, Danny wants to put together a Jason-like group. They were the ones that he says they were under the auspices of DARPA. They were scientists, brilliant scientists. He says physicists. He goes, but I think we need to do that outside of the military, industrial, corporate world and put together a group of people such as those of us who are gathered here and others to try to do everything we can to come up with a better understanding of not only what this phenomenon is, but also the beings who are behind this. And taking into account information that Marshall has and other people have to try to evaluate that. With the assistance of Adam and John Valentino and other people like this, we've got Eric Weinstein, who's involved in this now, who knows a lot of people, as Adam does, and John, who are extraordinary scientists and physicists who do not appear to have been asked with trying to figure out some of this stuff. And that I will transcribe the Adam, Eric Weinstein lecture and the panel, but he talks a lot about how, the best theoretical physicists that he knows have not been asked about UFOs. They don't know about the New York Times article, and he's baffled by that. So Danny continues. Jeff Kripal said yesterday, the major problem is we need funding, we need resources, grants. That's what we need to get other people involved. We have the virtual institute that helps. We'll have panels. We'll try to figure this stuff out. And he goes, but in case you hadn't been noticing, I'd like to recruit all the guys on the panel. And all of us, all of us that we view to be sound and responsible, rational people to deal with this. All of us acknowledge that this has got to be one of, if not the most important single event in our entire lives. And they've been telling people, and he means the others, they've been telling people about global climate change. They've been warning people about what we're doing to our planet. The consistency of these kinds of messages can't be ignored. And I'm not suggesting, and by the way, there are messages telling us about global climate change and we're destroying our planet. That doesn't mean they care about us. They could just care about the planet. And that's kind of what Marshall Summers says. That's kind of what got these intervening forces here, because we're destroying the resources that they rely on, what they came here for. So, if you believe that, then they really don't care about us. And then we get back to Ralph Blumenthal, and he says, Danny, this is one of the best things Ralph said in the entire panel. And I think it's the furthest he's gone as far as this specific subject. He goes, Danny, this evidence exists in the most deeply hidden parts of not only our government, but outside our government. In the private contractors, they have this information. We've heard this. We can't get at it. They're not amenable through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. Even the government, even Lue's group, as I'm sure he might or might not even acknowledge, was unable to get their hands on it. There are secret, super secret corners of our country, our establishment, particularly the private component, private industry, Lockheed, etc., where this stuff is held. We're convinced, but we can't get at it, and that's the object. That's the place to go looking. And then Richard goes, yes, exactly. And back to Danny Sheehan, he's like, I believe that we can get it. I can tell you, I believe that we can get it, but we have to make a concentrated effort on getting it. We've tried to do it inside the rules and regulations that have been drafted by those who are keeping it, but we need to do everything necessary. This is a state of emergency we're in here. Not necessarily because of any particular threat that the others pose, but because of our dealing with global climate change, There's technology that may be available that our human family can get access to. Not by compromising ourselves, by asking the extraterrestrials to give it to us, but we may have possession of information. We cannot stand around twiddling our intellectual thumbs, saying nothing about sitting on them, while the earth burns and while our whole nation goes into chaos with people fighting with each other. We've got to step forward as men and women who care about our human family, care about our planet, and who have strong suspicions that the information exists. And I can tell you, if information exists, we can get it. People were always astonished that we were able to get to the bottom of the Iran-Contra stuff and who's smuggling the cocaine. And just because you couldn't get Congress to admit that they knew what was going on, we disabled that whole operation and we exposed it. The same way with the Pentagon Papers. We got at that information. As long as they know that there are sound, and he's talking about they, the people who have this information, whistleblowers, as long as they know there are sound and responsible people that are trying responsibly to get at the information, people will come out of the woodwork. People will come to us, as long as there is a place for them to come. Build the field and they will come. So that's what I'm about here. I'm trying to have these type of conversations that some people find disturbing, some people find upsetting, but we're the kind of people who have been working at this particular subject, and we can do it. I believe that we can. So that's what we're dealing with here. That's the reason for this conversation. That's the reason for putting Marshall on the spot where he feels a little uncomfortable about having to talk about this thing. But it's necessary to get it out in front of us here. And Lou said, I think Marshall had a question, by the way. And then Marshall says, no, you go ahead, Luis. Did you have a question? And Lou goes, no, after you. I saw your hand up. You go first, my friend. And that's just showing, Lou being so polite and Marshall being treated well, which I was very happy to see. And Marshall says, I just want to say that I really appreciate your respecting me. And I almost thought he was going to cry here. He says, I just want to say that I really appreciate your respecting me. And I've been at a lot of denial and criticism and called many different things. Somebody, I think, on your chat actually said, I was a stooge of the Defense Department, a stooge of the Pentagon. And Lou's like, who said that? And Marshall's like, someone said it on your chat. And Danny's like, wait a second. That's Lou's title. And Lou says, yeah, I've already got that one. So you're going to have to get another title. And they all laugh. And Marshall says, and by the way, yeah, Marshall just comes across as a really, really nice guy. I don't know if his information is accurate, but I think he's the fact that he's giving this information away for free on his website, all 4 of the first 4 books. I don't think he's in this for money or fame. I think he really thinks this is legitimate information and he wants to share it. So he goes, Marshall says, I thought to myself, now I've been called everything. I just want to say I've received 9,000 pages of information and I'm in the process of publishing it all. It's going all over the world and I'm making most of it just available to people. All I can say is that I have a serious life and I also have a very tangible life. But I think that potential is in all of us, and I think we can analyze from an intellectual or a rational viewpoint. But we're not looking at a human universe where human reason is practiced, or the limits of technology, the limits of rationality are at all observed. Or it may have been transcended long ago. Basically, he's saying, we need to look at this from a different viewpoint, from just our limited human viewpoint. So he says, I think we have to think within the box to communicate to people, but we can begin to think outside the box. And I think you are all part of this because of extraordinary reasons. I don't think it's just circumstance that you ended up in this very puzzling and sometimes very uncomfortable interest or connection. Most people would rather not go there. So I just want to say that it's important that we honor or explore how we really feel about things, because the deeper knowledge within us mostly comes through our feelings, sometimes as ideas or images, and in many different ways for different people. But we can only ascertain so much about a foreign intelligence. What we can ascertain from evidence is intent, and I think that from my perspective, these briefings are like extraterrestrial whistleblowers that have revealed a picture that could not find our own. Pieces to the puzzle. And I'm gonna go back a little. He goes, these briefings are like extraterrestrial whistleblowers that have revealed a picture that we could not find on our own. They're pieces to the puzzle that we cannot gain here from standing on Earth. We cannot be outside our Earth, watching what is occurring there. And they're helping us to assemble this puzzle for ourselves. They don't give us all the answers to everything, but we're missing some big things. And I'm saying this is for our own purview, for our own our own investigation. Not what we're going to publish in the New York Times or try to have published in a major newspaper or magazine. I think we can all feel things that are honest and feel things that are dishonest. And when I talk about knowledge, I'm talking about core response to things that we can't intellectualize. We can't explain why we feel bad about the situation or good about the situation. We may be able to fill that in if we get to know it and have the information. But we're missing so much information about this that we as individuals, citizens of this world, members of the human family, have an opportunity to begin to explore this on our own, to answer some of our own questions and try to get connected through our own innate experience. I think this is something you can't prove. You can't quantify how we know things. If it's authentic and it can be verified of things that actually happened or proved to be true, represents just a mysterious part of ourselves. And this is the mind beyond the brain that watches the brain. And I always wonder, if you watch your own thoughts, who is you watching your own thoughts? And who is you watching your own thoughts? And he laughs. He goes, it's a Buddhist kind of practice. I'm watching myself watch myself. So it's not just to provide evidence, but to give a perspective that I think we have to explore. And Danny says, I agree. He goes, one of the other remarkable newsworthy events that has taken place here, besides the New York Times reporting and the DOD, the Director of National Intelligence putting out the report, he says, on virtually the same day that Lue and I know, Lue filed his complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office in the early morning of May 3rd of this year, and that afternoon, the Inspector General issued a public memorandum stating that they were going to engage in a wide-ranging, not investigation, but an evaluation of all the actions, if any, that any element of the Defense Department had undertaken with respect to the UAP phenomenon. This is an extraordinarily important piece of information, and I think Lue and I can be honest and share with you that my sense was, and I think Lue shares this, the people that are involved in this evaluation inside the Department of Defense are honest, good faith men that we have met. And Lue says, I agree wholeheartedly. Danny says, they've been kept in the dark about this phenomenon, but they have a responsibility, even if it's only at the evaluation level, and that it hasn't yet gone to a full investigation. They have the authority to call people before them and ask the right questions and get the answers to their questions. And if that happens, this is me talking, and they bring in somebody like Susan Goff, raise your right hand, Miss Goff. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about UAPs and Lue Elizondo and the ATIP program and OSAP? That would be an amazing pay-per-view event just to see Susan Goff squirming on the stand. And I know it's not like a trial, but I would love to see her have to go before the Inspector General and answer questions truthfully. Under oath. I'm not sure if they do under oath, but I would love that. And Danny continues, if the Inspector General starts to discover that they've been stonewalled in the same way that you were, Lue, then we have an opportunity to be of assistance to them in conducting a good faith evaluation of what the information is. It doesn't mean that they're going to give it all to us. They may share it with you, Lue, because Lue has the classifications and security clearances that I don't have. But it seems to me that that is a very real active edge of the investigation that's going on now, even if it's only called an evaluation. And I think that we're in a unique position, all of us, because we have the ability to be communicating with you, Lue, all of the kinds of information and different sources of information that we have. And you have the capacity to sit with these other men and share this information. Because I think you agree, I have the distinct sense that in our meetings with these guys, the Inspector General, that they are inviting the information. They're open to trying to get Lue to share with them what Lue was able to determine in his ATIP investigations, because they have been left in the dark. And I'm going to take a drink break. And Lou jumps in and says, I think that's correct, Danny. I think there's an honest attempt to reconcile what they have been told, the Inspector General, previously about this topic versus what they're learning now. My impression was the same. Mr. Stone and his cadre are extremely professional, extremely competent and adept, and they seem like very patriotic people that want to do the right thing for the American people and their boss. I applaud that. I also agree with Adam that consciousness is not just a result of electrical synapses in the human brain. I think it's safe to presume at this point there's something more to it. You know, philosophically, there's always been some sort of division between, quote, the mind, the body, and the spirit, unquote, as being distinctly three different things. And of course, it's easy to look at a human body and understand the physiology, to look at a mind and be able to understand neural pathways. But the third component is far more difficult. But I don't think it's any less important. And again, this goes to my belief that all data must remain on the table until it's no longer on the table. I know from my own perspective, and this may surprise some people, may be a surprise to some people, I don't ever talk about it, but I happen to know a thing or two about the remote viewing program, and I'm not going to go into much detail than that. John from I Want to Know UK, he said that Hal Puthoff told him that Lou was trained by Hal in remote viewing. So, and also Lou has spoken about how he was actually in the remote viewing program for a few days. He said it, and he kind of blew it off back then when he said that. He goes, hey, it was like an accident. Well, not so sure it was an accident. Maybe it was. Maybe that's how he met Hal. But Hal trained him in remote viewing, according to John. I Want to Know UK. That's his Twitter handle. So Lou says, but when we're having a conversation with the public, we must understand that you're talking to people who have not been indoctrinated into this topic at all. The most they've seen is maybe a couple of sci-fi movies on TV, and they've been told to be dismissive, that this is something, a topic of fringe. So when you're asking them to do a complete 180-degree turn or so, there's that old adage of crawl, walk, run, right? So you've got to crawl before you walk. You've got to learn how to walk before you run. Well, I think we're still in the stage of slithering and writhing on the floor. We haven't even begun to crawl yet. So it's going to take time for us to get there. This goes into the question of remote viewing and even things such as channeling. I'm not sure there's much of a difference between a prophet, a channeler, a remote viewer, or anything else. It seems to me that the skill sets seem to be the same, but perhaps one of the greatest challenges we have that with understanding consciousness may be because consciousness isn't inherently only a human thing. Where the body is and the human mind is, perhaps consciousness is something a little bit more indelible or something a little bit more universal beyond just our species, potentially. And as a result of that, it tends to be a little bit harder to define or a little bit harder to understand because it's not a completely human thing to begin with. And that's kind of one of the things I've said, that if we ever can prove to enough people that UFOs are real, then they can say, they're going to say, what else have we been lied to? We were lied to for 70 years about UFOs. And then I want to immediately transition into something like remote viewing, because you may not have been lied to about that. Although back in 1995, when the remote viewing program supposedly ended, and they went live on Ted Koppel's Nightline. And they had somebody from the CIA was on that panel. I think Joe McMonagle, one of the best remote viewers, remote viewer 001. I think he was there too. There were pros, opponents and proponents for the remote viewing program. But the guy from the CIA was basically like, yeah, there was really nothing to see here. So yeah, they did lie to us about that because there was something to see there. And remote viewing is far from perfect, but there are times when they have results that they called an 8 martini result. So basically, the result was that good, that accurate, that it blew them away, and they had to recover their, their minds, their, what's the word? Can't think of the word, but basically the result was so good that they had to go out to a bar and have 8 martinis just to recover. It was just amazing. It just changed their worldview of what is possible with human beings. So Lue jumps in and says, and that just basically one more time, yeah, so people will say, what else have they lied to us about? First is UFOs, and then we'll say, yeah, remote viewing, and humans have amazing capabilities. And I also think the occupants of these craft either, one, have abilities that far surpass human beings as far as telepathy and that kind of thing, or they have similar abilities and they use technology, to boost it. Psychotronic weapons. I'm not sure which one is the case. Are they naturally more gifted than humans, or are they using technology to make it appear that they're more gifted? And then Lue goes back to saying, what I wanted to say, Marshall, is please understand, when I'm quote unquote sharpshooting you, I'm not really, and I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm simply doing is posing to you the questions of an investigator. The reason why I don't superimpose my own thoughts into things and my own beliefs is because I'm not sure it's fair nor relevant. It's just like when Ralph is writing an article for the New York Times. His opinion doesn't matter. What matters are the facts, and you have to really separate yourself. So when I'm asking you these questions, Marshall, it's not because I believe or don't believe you. It has nothing to do with belief at all. I'm just trying to look at this from an outside perspective and ask questions so I can try to evaluate the authenticity of the information. It really has nothing to do about you. So basically he's saying, Marshall, it's not you, it's me. A Seinfeld reference. Lue says, it's really is nothing to do about you. I'm trying to understand where the information is coming from, right? That's what I try to do. But please don't look at this and feel that I think it's hogwash, because I actually have maybe a surprising perspective that you're not aware of. And then Lue smiles. That's the smile on that picture. He goes, but I keep those very private, and it's important as an investigator that I remain as objective and as fair as possible. And so that's why I ask you the questions that I do. It's not personal. And then talking about the remote viewing program and how it shut down, and Blumenthal says the CIA shut down or stopped supporting the remote viewing program, saying it proved a complete dud, right? And Danny says, total bullshit. Total more lying bullshit. And Ralph says, interesting that they said that. Number one, after all those years of supporting it and putting all that money towards it. And then Lue jumps in and says, well, Ralph, are you sure that it's actually gone? And Ralph laughs. And then Sheehan says, I don't believe it's gone. And Lue says, I'm not going to answer that question, but are you sure it's not being used anymore in the United States government? And he's talking about the remote viewing program. And Danny says, nobody puts aside that capacity that has been established. And I think Ralph said, right. And Danny said, that's just total hogwash. And I just want to say that, yeah, if you talk to any of the remote viewers over the past few decades, they all suspected that the program was still going on. They never said they had information that it was going on, but to back that up, James Ian Dolan said that he had confirmation that the program was still going on, engaging the phenomenon. So there's that. So Ralph says, I just want to say one other thing. The UFO debate has been around for decades, as we know, since the war, the post-war period, and back and forth. All these reports that Richard is citing, properly so, that would be great to see the light of day. But what changed everything, in my view, is the Navy videos that gave us a physical imprimatur, a positive proof that these things exist. So what we're looking at now, we, me, the Times, the media, is something that will move the story forward, that will add to the information we already have, that will take it, catapult it to a new dimension or a new level, that will tell us something that we don't already know, that will prove something that we long doubted. So that, I think, is the challenge for Lue and for everybody who is in possession of this information. And Dolan says, how about an analysis of the Davis-Wilson notes? I'm just saying. Exactly. And we do know that they were working on the Wilson-Davis notes or Davis-Wilson notes. And I don't know if they were not able to get enough information to get it past their editor. I assume that's what happened. But yeah, Ralph was live on Facebook where he didn't realize he was live, and he was talking to Michael Hall about collecting information about the Wilson-Davis notes. So that's how we found out. The New York Times was at least investigating that. And Danny says, we have the advantage of having Lue working at the tip of the spear of this continuing investigation. I mean, there's no doubt at all about the interaction that we're having with the Inspector General's office. We're engaged in an still active investigation. They can't get rid of Lue Elizondo that easily, okay? And Lue is the kind of guy that once he starts going after a piece of information, you can't just say, forget it, go away, we're not going to hand it to you. He's not going to go away. He's going to continue this investigation, and we're going to be working in coordination with him in the same way Ralph, a great reporter, doesn't drop a great story, and we know that Ralph is going to keep going after this. Richard, you've been going at this for decades. We know perfectly well you're not going to go away, no matter what they might try to do to you, no matter what they might try to do to you, or how they might try to discredit you. Whatever it is that's going to happen, your friends are all around you, okay? It's like, what the hell does Ralph know that we don't know? Whatever they're going to go to do to Dolan or whatever they're going to do to discredit him, it's really kind of weird. But I know he didn't mean anything by that. But Danny says, and we know that, Richard, you're going to continue pushing on this information. Adam, you have access to some really, really important information about the kind of objective work that you've done there at Princeton and your other friends and colleagues. Marshall, you have access to a unique, completely, sincerely believed in source of information, and we know that these things happen. Police departments use psychic people to go and find criminals. We know this goes on all the time, and they don't like to talk about it. But if we can maintain continued communication among ourselves, taking leadership from people like Lue and taking leadership from people like Ralph and Richard and even Marshall, with leadership from people like you, Adam, that we can find this information out, even if we have to use remote viewers to find it. He goes, because the fact is, I know, and you guys all know, why Pat Price got into trouble with the FBI for going into that building and what he was capable of doing. We can get this information. They cannot hide this information from us, okay? So all we have to do is be willing to participate in all this all together, and I believe that we are. We have other allies around. What you see here, Marshall, is allies of humanity. And Ralph says, human allies. And Danny's like, yes, human allies of humanity. And Marshall says, yeah, this team needs some good allies right now. Danny says, that's right, we need all the allies we can get, and we will take them from extraterrestrial sources, we'll take them from remote viewing sources, we'll take them from investigative sources and reported sources, and we will get this information. And we will handle it responsibly, and we'll share it with our people, and we will exercise our constitutional fundamental rights to get access to this information and use it responsibly to not only solve the problems of the UFO, but our global climate change and our other major problems. And we need to earn the trust of all our people engaged in this process, okay? And Marshall closes it by saying, gentlemen, it was great to meet you all. I would love to be in contact with any of you who would like to be in contact with me. Danny says, absolutely. Dolan, thank you, Marshall. And Marshall says, I'm very respectful of everybody's experience here. And we all bring pieces to this puzzle, and we're all in this situation out of destiny or choice, however you might want to interpret that. Richard says, absolutely. And Danny closes with, he says, an important place in our human history. Great. Thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. I will see you all in the virtual world. So that is the panel, which I really enjoyed. And we need more of this kind of thing. We need more pushing. You know, if there are more people with information like Marshall, it's good to push, to ask questions. I think they did it respectfully. I don't think Marshall took offense to it, and I think we need to do it again. Hopefully, this happens again. I think it was fantastic, and hopefully, you guys will get to see. You'll get to see a little 20-minute segment that somebody posted on Vimeo. I put that in the blog, and also, hopefully, maybe one day, the conference folks they release that video because I think it's worth seeing. There's only so much I can do as far as trying to recreate it. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Any feedback is appreciated, even critical feedback. You know, constructive criticism is always appreciated. And once again, closing, it's my blog. I'm mostly on Twitter, but I'm trying to focus more on the blog and doing these type of videos, which take a while. This one was like 3 hours, and I did a couple of versions because I wasn't happy with the other ones. That's Patreon and PayPal, and finally Venmo. Hopefully you guys don't mind me doing that. I just do it at the beginning and at the end. And so, yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Check out the blog, and I will see you next video, and I'll see you on Twitter.